Let's talk in more detail about what's happening on the front lines with our guest, Pavel Lakiychuk, Head of Military Security Programs at the Center for Globalistics and Strategy 21, who is joining us live. Pavel, good morning and glory to Ukraine.
Greetings.
Glory to the heroes. Good morning.
Judging by the latest reports, it seems that fighting is still ongoing inside Pokrovsk, so to say that the situation there is clear or to draw any conclusions right now, I think is probably still too early. Pavel, how would you assess what is happening there now and the prospects?
Indeed, the situation in the entire Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration, and probably to the north of Pokrovsk as well. The Dovropil salient should also be taken into account. It's very complicated and ambiguous, and that's understandable because on both our side and the enemy's, most of the military forces that are actively involved in the entire battle in eastern Ukraine are currently concentrated there. The concentration of forces is enormous. On average, 5 times more drones are being used there than along the rest of the front line, meaning compared to other active sectors. You can imagine the level of intensity of the fighting. Russia is not entering the city with assault groups. This has also required our command to deploy special forces units. The combat tactics, specifically the ones that the Russians are currently imposing, involve fighting with individual units, but they do so in a carefully controlled manner. Close coordination and interconnection between units is crucial. The outcome largely depends on who is better informed and aware of the situation on the battlefield. It's important to understand that the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd-Krasnohorivka agglomeration is now both a political objective for Putin and a matter of survival for Gerasimov, who has already promised Putin the capture and encirclement of Pokrovsk, but none of that has happened. That's why both their chief of the General Staff and the Minister of Defense will throw all possible forces at Pokrovsk. At the same time, they will try to stretch our defenses and deprive us of reserves, operational reserves that could turn the situation around in this sector of the front in this key area.
Pavel, tell us, in your opinion, what does your analysis show and what is the possible development of the situation around Kupyansk? Just 2 days ago, the president spoke about this and said that the operation to clear this settlement of those representatives of the Russian Federation's army who managed to break into it is ongoing and must continue.
Well, in terms of combat tactics, the situation on the Pokrovsk direction is very similar to that on the Kupyansk sector of the front. But obviously, this is a new trend, and we will have to adapt to it and find new tactical approaches. Our command is finding them. If in the Pokrovsk direction the enemy's advantage in manpower is several times greater than in the Kupyansk direction, the situation is somewhat simpler. Naturally, there is no talk of encircling Kupyansk, just as there is none regarding Pokrovsk, because that was the Russians' plan. To envelop from the north, break through the river from the south, cut off a large group of Ukrainian troops, eliminate it, and create a breach in our defenses. That's what they wanted, but they failed to achieve it. The assault continues with infiltration in this way from the north into the city, but the Ukrainian Defence Forces are acting actively both in Kupyansk itself and to its north. To say that we will drive the Russians out of the city right now is obviously too optimistic. In Ovchansk, for example. By the way, today, yesterday, and the day before were very intense days. There, despite the fact that the dam was blown up, it would seem this was supposed to make things easier, to cut and disrupt the enemy's logistics, to facilitate the liberation of the city.
But it's significantly more difficult to drive out an enemy who has already managed to entrench themselves than to prevent them from doing so in the first place.
Pavel, let's clarify a bit for our viewers about this dam. Why am I saying this? We've seen a lot of such hysterical statements, even accusatory ones, from the occupiers. We're talking, as I understand it, about the dam of the Belgorod Reservoir, which is located on the Stary Oskol River. Basically, the main idea there was to raise the water level of the river. and this would have made things easier for the Ukrainian Defence Forces. As for the civilian population, as I understand it, there wasn't a scale of impact that would have posed any real threat. Let's also explain this point about the dam.
Well, first of all, this is not the Kakhovka reservoir, it's not the Kakhovka dam. Moreover, the Ukrainian Defence Forces struck one of the sluices in order to cause a controlled flooding. The idea comes down to so that instead of rain, roughly speaking, to flood the roads and complicate the enemy's logistics. But overall, this was successful because there was a buildup of forces there and more active operations were expected. Russia was expected to launch an offensive operation. Well, in general, if you look at the intensity of the fighting in that sector, yesterday, today, the day before yesterday, just look at it that way. Obviously, these preemptive actions were both forced and necessary. On the other hand, it's important to understand that defending in these muddy conditions is harder, but attacking isn't really an option either. So this is a way to stretch out the confrontation over time in a deliberate manner and make things easier for our forces here and now.
Pavel, tell us, how do you assess this and what are the objectives if we talk about the strategic plans and their implementation by the armed forces of Ukraine? The recent long-range strikes that have targeted energy infrastructure are connected not only to supporting the defense industry but also to an entire specific region of the Russian Federation. Most recently we saw the Kostroma-Gres, and before that there was the energy infrastructure in the Vladimir region in the city of Orel. We saw certain explosions. What is all this supposed to lead to? Obviously with, let's say, fairly frequent actions, such as those specifically aimed at disconnecting various infrastructure facilities in the Russian Federation from the power supply.
I might be wrong, but from my point of view, we've already discussed that the Ukrainian armed forces have two main objectives with these strikes deep into Russian territory, and those are the destruction of their military-industrial complex, the weakening of the Russian army, its logistics, and its rear support. The second is our so-called kinetic or combat sanctions against the Russian oil fleet, oil transfer operations, which are meant to weaken the flow of those bloody oil routes that supply the Russian army. But as for the strikes on the energy sector, last night, by the way, there were also quite significant strikes. That's a slightly different story. This is a story about how this is an adequate response to Russian strikes, to Russia's attempts to plunge Ukraine into a blackout. Ukrainian President Zelensky warned Putin that this is not 2022 and he shouldn't even try. If they attempt to freeze Ukrainians, we will respond appropriately. And this is precisely where the strategy of deterrence works, when words are firmly backed up by decisive actions. And here is a separate important cluster that should clearly demonstrate and stop Putin and his criminal gang from striking our energy sector and attempting acts of terror against the civilian population.
Yes, Pavel, indeed, there will be no repeat of what happened in 2022, as they might have hoped. And the Putin regime, along with all its henchmen, lackeys, and servants of the Kremlin and Putin's regime, should understand that this is truly a two-way street, a road with two lanes for movement. And there will be a response accordingly. Thank you for the conversation. We appreciate you joining us, Pavel. You are always welcome here. On air with Freedom TV channel. Pavel Lakiychuk, Head of Military Security Programs, Center for Global Studies, Strategy 2.